In this presentation, we're going to illustrate what a fishery is or is made of by using a case study from Nam Ton 2 Reservoir in Laos. The presentation here is based on a publication that reviewed several years of environmental and fisheries management and was published in 2021. So here we're going to present the Nam Ton 2 hydropower system and the reservoir. Say a few words about the intended development of a fishery on this reservoir, what are its components, and how this was studied and developed, and this will allow reaching some conclusions. So Nam Ton 2 is based in central Laos in the highlands, and you can see here the shape of the reservoir and of the various tributaries coming into the reservoir, the power station from which the water is turbined and sent into the Sebangphai River and down of the reservoir. Nam Ton 2 is a hydropower project that has been subject to considerable debates, but here we're not going to talk about the hydropower production or the dam itself, but we shall focus on the reservoir fishery since it's providing a miniature case study quite interesting to highlight all the components of a fishery. The Nam Ton 2 hydropower system is both big and particular. It's big with more than 1,000 megawatts and a dam 40 meters high. It started in 1994 with the first studies, and operation started long later in 2010. The dam is special because it takes water from one watershed, the Nam Ton watershed here, but the water is turbined and released into another watershed, the Sebangphai River, that ultimately reaches the Mekong River. The reservoir itself is quite big with 450 square kilometers, which corresponds to about 60 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. The depth reaches 8 meters, and the surface area varies very substantially between the wet and the dry season. Population around this reservoir is not very high, with only 16 hamlets and a population of about 2,200 people. Here are pictures about this reservoir with the natural forest that got flooded, and ultimately after a few years the open water is visible here and the remaining flooded forest on the edges. This is what it looks like nowadays once the flooded vegetation has died. And fishing is one of the main activities on the lake, as you can see here, with gill nets and fishermen in operation. So from the beginning, the dam developers saw the reservoir creation as an opportunity to develop a fishery bigger than the original fishing taking place in the river before the construction of the dam. And fishing was seen as the development as an alternative livelihood. So there was substantial investment and management to develop a sustainable fishery on this reservoir. And the study we did for the publication is a review of almost 100 publications and internal reports over 10 years to understand how this fishery was put in place and what it became. The interesting case during the creation of this reservoir here in 2008 is that during a period of time, here 1 year, there was a trophic explosion because all the flooded vegetation provided food for a number of species and a number of them proliferated. But then, after this phase of intensive and abundant food, there was a trophic depletion. Usually the trophic depletion can take a few years. Here it only took about 1 year. And the whole process in this reservoir moved faster than in other dams in the world because the reservoir reached stabilization within 2 years with a very low trophic level, which means that the water was not so nutritious for fish. As a result, the original diversity decreased a lot, and the fishermen were left with 2 dominant species only, a cyprinid and a tilapia. This is what a fishery is made of. It starts with fish species, and depending on the environment, fish species and environment allow the creation of a fish stock. This fish stock is harvested by fishers. The activity of fishers depends on credit, on alternative livelihoods, on the way they are organized. And that activity of fishers harvesting the fish stocks creates the fish supply. The fish supply is influenced by the fishing effort, which corresponds to the number of boats and the nature and the number of gears. This fish supply is partly used for self-consumption, but there is also value adding to this fish supply through processing, through quality control, so that the processed fish is worth more than the raw fish. All this activity is subject to a policy environment about access rights, who can fish, constraints, is there fishing season, are there limitations about fishing gears, and facilitation, is there credit, for instance. Ultimately, the fish harvested, either raw or processed, is available for fish marketing. The fish marketing depends on trade. The trade itself depends on competition between traders or sometimes the presence of monopolies and access to credits. But fish marketing also depends on infrastructure, that is transport, landing sites, markets, and possibly preservation facilities. So the fish marketing ultimately targets buyers. So we can say this is a fishery, the whole set of actors and components. In the next slides, we will review the studies done and the aspects covered during those 10 years. In terms of fish supply, the catch was monitored during more than 10 years. The environment was extensively monitored in terms of hydrology, water quality, plankton, invertebrates. The fish stock was also carefully studied in terms of diversity and taxonomy, biological studies of the key species, fish stock assessment, creation, and impact of protected areas. And the fishing effort as well was detailed during more than 10 years of monitoring with a monitoring of gears, of boats, but it is acknowledged that there was a lot of unregistered fishing. Fishers themselves were subject to resettlement after socioeconomic studies, to a monitoring of their activities, of their income, but there was no study of their expectations of why they would enter the fishery or leave the fishery, what were their priorities, what were their constraints, or what were their alternatives. In terms of policy environment, the fisheries were subject to many policies with various decrees and regulations about fishing, restrictions about who was eligible to become a fisher, or only the local villagers, the creation of village fishers groups and fishers associations, participations to management units, creation of protected areas, checkpoints, patrolling, and taxes on landings. But it is recognized that there was ultimately limited enforcement of all these policy measures. In terms of marketing, the policy environment consisted on restrictions about who is eligible to become a fishmonger, control of fish markets and of fish prices, and a tentative taxation. But overall, this resulted in multiple constraints and also changing rules and regulations, which did not facilitate the creation of a marketing system around the fish harvested. Self-consumption was assessed over time, but the results were neither public nor really used for management. And special attention was paid to value adding through training in processing. And actually, there was limited interest because local people preferred fresh fish, and also because of the economic constraints over fish processing. And all of that was done with no quality control. In terms of fish marketing, a significant effort was put by the dam company on infrastructure development with the provision of boats and gear, 662 boats in total, with the construction of landing sites, markets, facilities, but it should be noted that local people did not always use those facilities. In terms of trade, there was a monitoring of landings, of prices, of values, but the trade arrangements at the different levels, from the fisherman to the ultimate trader, were not clearly known. And in fact, there was non-official trade with unofficial landing of fish outside the landing sites, and that part remains a little fuzzy. And as for buyers, the demand, prices, and the competition of the fish supply was never considered. So if we summarize here, the level of knowledge or the level of management from extensive to fragmentary or nil. We can say that the knowledge and the management of fishers was partial. The fishing effort was not really well known nor managed. The environment was well known, extensively known. Fish stock was pretty well known, just like the fish supply. The fishery policy environment was extensive, but the marketing policy environment was not really detailed. Self-consumption was partially known, and there was substantial knowledge and management in terms of added value. That corresponds to substantial level of investment in infrastructure, but ultimately the fish marketing and the fish trade were not really well known, and the information about the ultimate buyers was fragmentary or even non-existing. This was about the level of knowledge and management, but ultimately we also need to acknowledge the fact that the level of controls varies depending on the component of a fishery. In fact, the level of control over species is nil. Species react in relation to their genetic traits and in relation to the environment, and this cannot be controlled by managers. The level of control of managers over the environment and over fish stock is low. Management can better control fishers and the fishing effort, and therefore the fish supply. The level of control over the policy environment is good, and over value adding is quite good. Similarly, the level of control over infrastructure is also quite good, which means that the fish marketing can be pretty well controlled. But trading cannot be so well controlled because it depends on other factors, or it can also be informal. And in the end, the management cannot control buyers. This being acknowledged, it's clear now that what is usually presented as the components of a fishery, that is environment, fish, and fishers, is in fact more complex than that, because we also need to consider markets and policies, as you can see illustrated here. And this is illustrated by different photos. A fishery is made of fishers landing fish, of traders at a landing site, of a post-harvest sector, here frozen fish being packed to be shipped, and of detailed traders, but also the fishery is made of rules and regulations that completely shape the functioning of that system. In conclusion, the last slide about what a fishery is. A fishery is made of fish species and environment, creating a fish stock. The fishers and their fishing effort harvest that fish stock and create a fish supply. On the other hand, you have infrastructure and trading that correspond to fish marketing, and the policy environment influences both the fish supply by influencing fishing effort, fishing conditions, or trade and infrastructure, And you need to also consider value adding through processing, post-harvest, and all of that. Fish marketing is targeting buyers. These are all the components of a fishery. So when doing fishery management, one has to keep that whole diagram with its multiple components in mind. Thank you for your attention.